Okay, so I'm going to kind of describe how my grandpa confused me, but how I recognize that his ideas are really profound. But okay, so just like one example is one thing I asked my grandpa was like, what do you think about like HIV? And people say like stuff like HIV or stuff like that is punishment from God for sins. What do you think of the idea of like diseases being punishment for sins? My grandpa says that's magical thinking. That confuses me because it's like, okay, you're supposed to take responsibility, but to say that that like diseases are punishments from God for sins, that's magical thinking. But so my grandpa would say though, but the reason why it's magical thinking is because now I understand. But like I said, he always said that he was a transpersonal psychologist, and he never really explained to me he was an existential metapsychiatrist. And I only figured that out really in 2020 when I was at Washington and I started reading Dr. Horace's books, who's my grandpa's teacher, who he got his PhD under. So I always knew that he was a transpersonal psychologist, and he'd say that there is no person, everything is one. He would say everything is energy, but there's other ways to see everything as one. Everything is consciousness, everything is a quadrant model. There's other ways to see everything as one, but he would see it as energy. Everything is energy, and God is energy. Now, he would say that it's magical thinking to say, disease and stuff is punishment for sin, because the idea of punishment is dualistic. And he would say, like, one thing he would teach is there is no good or bad, there's just consequences. Okay? And so good versus bad, right versus wrong, of course there's always shades of gray, but he would say there's no good or bad, there's just consequences. And he would say that if you believe that, like, disease is punishment for sin, that's magical thinking, because my grandpa would say, then you believe in a separate God that punishes you for sins. But my grandpa would say, there is no separate thing. Everything is one. There is no thing. Now, when I read Dr. Horace's book in 2020, he would describe God as infinite love intelligence. And he would say that everything is energy in a way, but he would also say like everything is like a dream. But I think that my grandpa tried to make things too rational and try to take out the intelligence aspect, because I think that's why he couldn't understand the idea of the quadrant model. Because my grandpa would be like, that's magical thinking, to think that there's some sort of quadrant pattern that pervades all reality. That's kind of magical thinking, but it is maybe reality is magical, but he tried to make things very rational and be like, yeah, Jesus could you see, but this confused me, because I'm like, okay, so you're against the idea of a separate God. So I'm like, okay, so you're more rational, you're more of a scientist. And I like that, because remember, I was anti-religious, especially anti-Christian, because I wanted to destroy the white race, and I was a Marxist. But my grandpa wasn't a Marxist, though, so it confused me. So I'm like, okay, so you don't really believe in a separate God, but you're not a Marxist. So he's spiritual, but he's not a Marxist. I mean, he's spiritual still. And I still thought that spirituality was still white supremacist. And also there's his idea of like, take responsibility for everything. I thought that was white supremacist, because it blames the victim. So I was confused, but so I liked his ideas because they seemed a little anti-religious, especially anti-Christian. And I was anti-Christian because I wanted to destroy the white race, seeing myself as Jewish, seeing the white race as a threat. And I was a Marxist, and I thought that religion kept people in line and maintained the status quo and maintained white supremacy. But at the same time, my grandpa, he seemed spiritual though still, but he seemed kind of anti-religious. So I was just confused. So I'm like, okay, so belief that God punishes people for sins through disease is magical thinking. I'm like, okay. So I was like, so then how do you explain disease? Because my grandpa would say, though, that, if you're not in the flow, you're more susceptible to getting sick. And if you are in the flow, you won't get sick. So this is confusing me. So I'm like, okay. So my grandpa's is confusing, but now I understand. Because now that in 2020, I started to figure it out, because I read Dr. Horace's books, and the book was called Existential Metapsychiatry, and I started studying existentialism. And I started to study that the idea that existentialists say you don't want to blame. That's why my grandpa says it's existentially invalid to believe in like Darwinism, because then it leads to problems, because you don't take responsibility. You say, oh, it's just my genes. My genes caused me to do these. And then you're not taking responsibility, and you're not getting in the flow. And then you have justification for existentially invalid behaviors that that cause suffering and not happiness, not the flow. So, but my grandpa would be like, so yeah, but it still seemed like victim blaming. Like, if you're in the flow, you're not going to get sick. But my grandpa would say, but you don't want to blame God because that's magical thinking. So that's an existentialist belief. They say, don't even blame God for anything. You take responsibility for everything. That's an existentialist belief. My grandpa would say he doesn't believe anything, but that's the way that they operate. So I didn't understand that, but now I understand. Okay, so that's why my grandpa would be like, okay, it's magical thinking to say that God caused you to get sick, because then you're not taking responsibility. Even though you could say, yeah, it was because of my sins, but my grandpa would say that's still dualistic software to believe that there's a separate God. My grandpa would just say, you're not in the flow. God is energy. You're not in the flow of the energy. You're not in oneness consciousness. You're not in pure awareness. And therefore, you make yourself more susceptible to getting sick because everything is energy. So this kind of confuses me a little bit, but now I understand what he's saying. But at the same time, like I'm studying the quadrant model and I'm seeing like, dude, there's 4 types of HIV and everything is built around this quadrant, and there is something magical. And the way I'm seeing it is it's not just everything is energy. And yeah, my grandpa would say that there is a complexification process and it's moving toward the omega point, and things aren't really random, but the energy events have this like innate principle where they evolve to more synergy toward the kingdom of heaven or the omega point and stuff. It's kind of a spiritual, but it's also kind of postmodern new age. But so it's still spiritual. I still see it as white supremacist and like work hard and synergy and everything. And I was still but I'm confused because like I want to be a Marxist because I'm anti-religious. I'm anti-God because I'm like, yeah, I'm anti-God because I want to destroy the white race. And I see myself as Jewish. So, but my grandpa still seems spiritual. Like everything is energy, everything's a flow, and you take responsibility. So now when I this is much later, I start to study Dr. Horror, and Dr. Horror would say that it's not God. If there's a storm, if you're sick, it is because of your existentially invalid thoughts. You're not in the flow. So it's kind of victim blaming in my idea. But my grandpa would be like, but it's not a separate God that's punishing you, because that's not. My grandpa would say that that's magical thinking and everything is one, there is no thing. And to believe in a separate God, my grandpa would say that's magical thinking. And also not existentially valid, because then you can blame a separate God for what's going on, when really really it's just you're not in the flow. And there's consequences to not being in the flow, and there's consequences to existentially invalid ways of seeing things and modes of being. And now I understand that. Now I understand that when I saw things with a Darwinian, Freudian lens, it led to a lot of problems for me, and I'm still trying to break free of that. It made me selfish that I want to impregnate a woman when we're not married, and I didn't make good decision in that because I just want to have babies so I can be superior. I was still in dualistic superior inferior software, self-confirmatory. And Dr. Horror would talk about transcending the self and self-confirmatory ideation into oneness consciousness, into flow, into pure awareness to see things as they really are. But I didn't see things as they really are, and I didn't make discernment. I didn't care because I had an existentially invalid way of seeing things. So, but my point though is, so I understand my grandpa's teachings, but at the same time, like I said, at this time, I was still confused because I'm like, okay, so he seems like he's anti-God, but he's not really. He's still spiritual. But I was anti-God, but I was a Marxist Freudian. I wasn't spiritual. I was the opposite of spiritual. I wanted to destroy religion and destroy spirituality because I saw spirituality and religion as white supremacists. So here's like some other ways that my grandpa would see things. So like when the Israelites would sacrifice animals, right? It said that it was a pleasing aroma to God. Now my grandpa would say God is energy. So obviously God is not smelling the aroma because that's anthropomorphizing God. And my grandpa would say that God is apophatic. You cannot, and that's why he said that it's a good metaphor to say God is energy, because my grandpa would say you cannot really describe energy. You cannot really put it into words. And same thing with God. And now I understand the reason why he says that. And he said you don't want to believe that, but the reason why you say that is because you don't want to have any beliefs. Because once you believe anything, you're attached. And you're not open to inspiration and the truth and the flow. So you don't want to be attached to any beliefs. But so like the idea that God smells a pleasing aroma of the sacrifices, my grandpa would say, no, this is just a metaphor. Maybe it's a metaphor of, when you sacrifice, that's letting go of your attachments. And when you're attached to anything, you're not in the flow. Because now I understand when you're attached to anything, but I'll get to when I started to understand this. But at this time in like 2020, I didn't really understand this yet. But I started to understand this later, but I'll get to that. I started to understand that after my daughter's death. But so in this case, it's like, okay, it's a pleasing aroma. My grandpa say that's anthropomorphizing God, but God is energy, or God, there is no separate God. So that my grandpa would say that really it's just a metaphor. Maybe the sacrifice is letting go of attachments, and the pleasing aroma is really just a metaphor, and it's just you get in the flow when you let go of your attachments. So it's not anthropomorphizing where you're like, oh, you you make a sacrifice and then you're pleasing a God and he's smelling it, and that a separate God. My grandpa said that's magical thinking. There is no separate God. My grandpa said it's magical thinking. But my grandpa would say the sacrifice is a metaphor of letting go of attachments so that you can be in the flow into pure awareness. In the sense that you're a wave and God is the ocean. You're an energy event and God is a wave and energy event and God is the ocean. You're not separate, right? So like another example of that might be like or like when God says vengeance is mine, or God says I'm a jealous God. My grandpa say God's not jealous. Emotions, my grandpa say emotions are self-confirmatory. If you're in the flow, you don't have any. Now I understand you don't have any experience when you're in the flow, because experience is based around the senses, based around the body. The body's an illusion. So when you're in the flow, there is, my grandpa, Dr. Horace said there is no such thing as a spiritual experience, because experience is based around the senses, and that's an illusion. Your senses do not see reality, and spiritual is reality. So, it says God is jealous. My grandpa would say God's not jealous. That's a metaphor. The metaphor would be the flow, that there's only one flow. And I would say probably, if you're worshiping idols, you believe that they're separate things. And then you're not in the flow. And that's a metaphor of God being jealous. But there is no thing. Everything is one. So you see what I'm saying? So my grandpa would say that, you don't really believe in a separate God who's jealous. That's magical thinking. And again, now I understand more as an existentialist. He doesn't believe in a separate God. The existentialists don't believe they take responsibility for everything. I guess if there were some religious existentialists, but still they take responsibility for everything. So to be like, oh, there's a separate God and he's causing these things to happen, then you're not taking responsibility. And it's still, and you still believe that you're a separate self and there's a separate God, but there is no self. There is no thing. You still are in a delusion that it's still self-confirmatory to believe that there's you and a separate God. So, like, also like I remember one time I asked him, like, what does it mean when it says, I'll get this, I guess, later, but like when God says vengeance is mine, right? You can anthropomorphize this, or my grandpa would say that means that you don't take vengeance, but the universe bends toward justice. And, there's consequences to negative, to being out of the flow. So if someone's out of the flow, then there's consequences. Another thing that he taught me was like, when it says in the Bible, like, blessed are those who curse, who bless Israel, and cursed are those who curse Israel. My grandpa would say, if you bless anything, if you curse anything, you're blessed or cursed, because everything is one, right? And that's dualistic software. And if you're not in the flow, then there's consequences. All right, so I'm trying to describe. So my grandpa kind of confused me and I think that this is why I went more toward because I'm thinking, my grandpa is saying, yeah, religion is kind of a delusion in the sense that, to believe in a separate God. My grandpa would say, like I said, a rabbi once said, I went to a rabbi's teaching and he said that anybody who does not believe the Bible is not a true Jew. And I asked my grandpa, what do you think about that? I was thinking, you don't believe the Bible, you're not religious. And my grandpa would be like, no, the rabbi is right. But the Bible is pointing to non-dual consciousness, the idea that there is no self, and transpersonal consciousness. So, but when my grandpa's saying that there is no separate God and stuff, I'm thinking like, okay, so my grandpa's not religious. He's like me. So that made me more of a Marxist and a Freudian, because my grandpa's like, yeah, religion's kind of a delusion, and my grandpa would say a lot of religion insider, outsider. Like, okay, this is one thing that my grandpa taught me. Like, I asked him, and this is one thing that made me think, again, he's a white supremacist, was I asked him, what do you think of the Freemasons? And remember, the Nazis didn't like the Freemasons. And my grandpa said, because the Freemasons were for like democracy, and some people think that the Freemasons were satanic. They wanted, Shukracharya was maybe like anti-religious and satanic. Shukracharya in Hindu mythology, he wanted the Dravidians to destroy the Aryans, and he was anti-religion. And that's a lot of people think the Freemasons are, and they really worship Satan. So I asked my grandpa, what do you think of the Freemasons? And my grandpa said he wouldn't be a part of the Freemasons because he said it's kind of insider-outsider software. And my grandpa says there is no self. But he doesn't want to judge like he would say that if you're in the flow, there is no formula, and you can join you can be a part of the Freemasons, you could learn from them as much as possible. Part of being in the flow is expanding your consciousness as much as possible. My grandpa said he would never be a part of the Freemasons because of the idea of insider-outsider software, and that's confirming the illusion that he's a separate self. And again, I was like, okay, well, my grandpa might be a Nazi because the Nazis were against the Freemasons. And then, like, another thing that my grandpa taught me, like, I remember I was playing some music for him, and and I asked him, like, what do you think of this music? And he was like, it was music like the Temptations and, like the black music. And, a lot of people would say when the black musicians were playing their music at first, like the jazz and the, their pop music and stuff, a lot of people said it was satanic. It was a communist, satanic attempt to take over Christians and stuff. And my grandpa said that he actually didn't like the music. So I was like, oh, my grandpa might be a Nazi, anti-communist, and he was against the black music and, the pop music and stuff because it had satanic influences and stuff. My grandpa was like, he didn't like it because a lot of it was like love music, like I'm with my baby and we love each other and stuff like that. And my grandpa says relationships are delusions or illusion because there is no self and there is no other. And my grandpa would say like a lot of it is just it's emotionalism but again, my grandpa would say there's no formula. Like when I played like some like Hare Krishna or like Hanuman Chalisas and stuff like that, my grandpa was like, yeah, that it could be meditative. That music can help you to meditate and transcend thoughts. But my grandpa said a lot of the pop music and stuff is more self-confirmatory. And like he didn't like Billie Eilish because he said it was very self-confirmatory, the song about being choked and stuff. But my grandpa did say that he liked Mozart because my grandpa said that Mozart, when he listened to Mozart, it soothed him. And it helped him to meditate so that he could transcend thoughts. Now, again, when I was a Marxist, I'm like, well, why do you want to transcend thoughts so much? Oh, because you want to just be, I was like Nietzsche, and I was a Marxist, and I'm like, oh yeah, because you just want to have the soothing music because you don't want to think, because you want to just, you want everyone to just be in a meditative state and just accept the status quo and be in awareness. But I didn't understand what pure awareness was. I was like, oh, you want to just be in awareness so you could just, just sit there and be like, duh, and I'm going to get nirvana. But really, you're just, that's just a tool by the elite. Religion is just a tool to make the weak feel powerful. And by thinking they're going to get nirvana and by meditating, they think they're going to be powerful, but just a way to maintain the status quo while, and really religion's just, it's a sinister tool. And I was a Marxist, right? But now I understand what my grandpa was saying. He wasn't saying to not think. So this is one thing my grandpa said. He said, you cannot get there from here, but only those who refuse to accept that will discover that there is here. And so you cannot get there from here. That's the flow. But only those who refuse to accept that. Yeah, there's a lot of thinking. So he says, sometimes in the pursuit of an answer, this is what Einstein said, sometimes in the pursuit of an answer, you have to exhaust all resources, and then perhaps while eating an apple, the answer will tap you on the shoulder. So my grandpa would say, yeah, you exhaust all resources. You do think, you do study, you do all that stuff. But then the answer comes when you let go. And when you let go, when you're eating the apple, that's when the answer taps you on the shoulder, because then you transcend the self and you're in the flow. But I was like, oh, yeah, you just want to meditate and not think. And that's why you like Mozart, because really you're just a white supremacist. And Mozart's a white guy. And that music is just to make so you can meditate so you don't have to think. And I'm a Marxist. I want people to think. And I want people to be angry. But my grandpa would say, no. What the Mozart does is it helps you, soothe you. And the beauty and the harmony of the music, it's not agitating you. And it helps you to transcend your thoughts. Because your thoughts are shaped around the ego, to the flow. And that's inspiration. That's the truth. As I was saying, it dances you to a standstill. It helps you to transcend the self. So I'll get more to what my grandpa taught.